They do not even know about internet, those people. They do not know. So, what to do? Now, I talked about the situation in France. The same situation, or a very similar one, was in what today is Germany. What already was Germany. So, in 1890s it was already Germany, and what also was especially in Hungary, I guess, in what is it called? Hungary, Germany, Austria. Germany, Austria. Bavaria, I think, is an independent state. Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, these are microscopic countries. So anyhow, practically nothing from there will have survived, because they have a microscopic population. In case of Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, and Bavaria, and also Switzerland. Very similar, especially Switzerland. In fact, in Switzerland, it was even more the case than in France, and that's the reason for which those peasants, very backward peasants, still exist today in Switzerland. So, and the situation in Italy and Portugal was very similar, and on top of that, the people that had suits, or anyone in fact, the peasants or whatever, they would burn all the clothing after the person had died, except for the poorest people. But the poorest people would use it until they became rags and they were not wearing suits. So, that is basically, I made a very brief recap of all of Europe, just for you not to waste your time looking for those items. And also, for you to understand the situation. What one has to understand is Britain was one of the tallest countries. So finding things that fit for the farther away one goes from Britain, and Germanic places like Germany and all, the shorter people got. Including France and then Italy, even worse, Spain and Portugal. Situation in the United States of America is, in a way, almost identical to in Britain, and in another way, almost identical to the French, more normal Western European situation of the peasants. And that depending, the United States of America is humongous. So is it the northern states, or the Confederate States, or ex-Confederate States, that had a peasant lifestyle? Now, in the ex-Confederate States, in other words, in southern United States of America, most of those people produced practically all the food consumed by them, the southern states, and the northern states. The northern states also imported from, I think, a bit of Europe, but practically nothing. They also grew but it mostly all came from, they also grew their own food, but it also came a lot from the southern states. Because white people are actually albinos, they cannot farm in the southern states. The reason for which they had slaves there to do the work for them. Those slaves, whereas they are named not paysans, although they worked like them, they were replacing the paysans because they could not be peasants because they were slaves. So they did not really have a culture of their own because they were slaves, that they would just wear what was given to them, and they were usually, a lot of them, in rags, oftentimes. In the 1890s, slavery had long been abolished, but they still had a lot of slaves until the 1920s, even sometimes into the 40s. Or people paid and treated so badly, they can be sort of considered slaves. So their garments, even if they were sort of alright when they died, first of all, they were not well sewed, and even when they had a sew, it would be worn and by another slave until the cloth died out. Those people in those areas were actually slaves, free men, in other words, the owner of slaves. There were less of them than free men in the northern states that did not really have slaves. In the northern states, albinos can farm without burning, so they farmed, but most of them had to import a lot from the southern states. So in the northern states, it was a situation a lot like in Britain, whereby even the working classes would actually work in factories. Most of the people were working class and working in factories, and then you have an upper middle class, which were much bigger than even in France, and then a bigger even upper class. So all those people in the northern states, at least a vast majority of them, quantity of them, would have had suits. But the same situation happens then with England or Britain or the rest of Europe for the middle classes that have, for the solid working classes that have suits, their clothing. It is worn and passed down until it is all cut down to a smaller suit until it becomes rags and is used to repair other suits. So it has not survived. But when you check the online eBay or online websites, Etsy and all, it seems like there are more surviving pieces, sorts and all, from America than in Britain. Why? Although in percent less has survived, because there were far more people, so far more clothing made. On top of that, United States of America was the first to mass produce garments, and then in the 1830s, at least for civilians, and then the first to mass produced that off on a much bigger scale, using the sewing machine, at least for menswear. It began with sorts and all in the 1860s, especially late 60s, early 70s. And it began in the early 60s for undergarments, but for sorts and all it really began in the early 60s. That by 1890 they were producing all menswear, any class, so mostly working class because most people were working class, but all menswear, any class in the United States of America, 40% of all their clothing for men and boys, all that clothing from the garments to other kids and all were mass produced, usually using machines, sewing machines and all, compared to like 5 to 10% in France and to 15 to 20% in Britain, like 15% in Britain, so much more. So that meaning more consumption, more clothing per inhabitants, and way more inhabitants. So although less inhabitants were upper middle class or even middle class, more clothing has actually survived if you take number by number, as in less percent has survived, but also more percent was made because of the mass factory production. So it means that more pieces date from that era over there. Now the sewing techniques and even to some extent styles were different, not so much in the northern states, but especially in the southern states because of the weather and the culture there. They also had that Wild West culture. Most of those clothing from those states were more homemade, less of it made because they had less money and less people. So most of the Wild West clothing has actually unfortunately not survived. But most of this northern states clothing, most of it has also not survived, but I mean a lot of it has survived and is available to normal people, whereas the Wild West, what you would think as cowboy clothing, has not really survived. It's very, very rare to find it, at least from before 1920s. Cowboys were valid until 1940, but in some backward areas, but prior to 1920 almost nothing belonging to them have survived, whether it be hats or undergarments or whatever. So the situation in the United States is much easier, but it will not be like British clothing. It will look almost identical to British clothing to non-knowledgeable people, but the construction is more like French clothing. And also they had a lot, the United States, unlike Britain, that was a part of the United States, a lot of people came from different countries, and so they imported the different sewing techniques and making ways of making patterns and all, and to the United States. So there, if you get upper class clothing, it starts looking, from the northern states, they start looking a lot like British clothing, because a lot of them would actually, if they had the money, go to Britain to have it made there, or they would go to more expensive, full bespoke tailors that actually were trained or even were British themselves in order to emulate the clothing, in other words, make it almost exactly the same. Then it was done on Savile Row, then where fashion was really from Savile Row back then. So it was not only English clothing, it was specifically Savile Row or Soho, another place in London, tellers, and each teller had their own way of doing it in Soho and Savile Row. So for example, what an upper class squire from the north of England who does not give a damn about Savile Row, he goes to local tellers there, it will be slightly different, the tailoring techniques and all. But it will more or less look more exactly alike, and again it will be mostly dark clothing that survives for the reasons explained prior. And that is the situation of the world there. Japan stuff, some of it has, and Turkish stuff as I explained it, but for those places you really have to go there, or at least know how to speak the language. Obviously learning how to speak Japanese and type it to look on the internet would be extremely difficult. And the same for China and those, what are commonly known as Asian places, but not Central Asia, so Vietnam, also known as Indochina, thence Cambodia, Philippines, so on and so forth. So that is how to acquire originals. look first of all on eBay, then look on Etsy. What I do is, if it is